One way that you can remember the entire outline of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures is by looking at it as a spiritual and religious history of the ancient Israelites. And to look at Israel as not just a person, a region, an ethnicity, and a religion, but look at it as an abstract idea that Israel had a life and that lives go through stages. You recall that the name Israel actually comes from this encounter that Abraham's grandson Jacob had with God, and God gives him this name, one who wrestles with God. Why he was wrestling with God is he wanted his blessing, because you remember the vision quest that God gave Abraham was that they would bless all the nations of the earth. So the Bible is a history of Israel's life, and where did it all begin? The first stage of Israel's life, as a metaphor, is the conception stage. And these are these stories in Genesis 1 through 11, the creation, the Garden of Eden, and the fall of humanity, Noah and the flood, where God conceived of a plan to repair what was broken in those stories. And he conceived of Abraham and Sarah and the culture that would come from them. And that's the birth of Israel as an idea. Abraham and Sarah are called to go to the land of Canaan. And if you recall that he said to them, I'm going to make you a great nation. But the purpose of that would be that they would be a blessing to all the nations or all the families of the earth. And in that sense, they would repair what was broken in Eden. So we move on to the next stage of their existence. And I call this the childhood stage. This is when they go from a really small tribe of kinsmen and they grow in size. And the way that this happens is through Abraham and Sarah's son Isaac and Rebekah, and then their grandson Jacob, who has children with Rachel, Leah, and their slave girls Bilhah and Zilpah. And that from them come the 12 sons of Israel and the one daughter Dinah. So what you see is growth from one stage of their existence as a people to the next stage. They go from a small group of kinsmen to a tribe of a few hundred people. The next phase is the teenage years, and I call this for a couple of different reasons. They followed Joseph down to Egypt during that famine, and they stayed. And that's where they grew completely to full size as a nation. Just like a teenager sometimes is a full-sized adult, but they're not really fully an adult yet. And so it's here you have the wilderness stories, 40 years in the wilderness. There's a little bit of rebellion. God gives them the 10 Commandments and the 613 laws of the halal, the pathway. And just like a teenager needs rules to sort of keep them on the path, that was true for Israel also. So you see this, right? They go from a small family of kinsmen. They grow in size under Abraham and Sarah's immediate family. And then eventually they move to Egypt, where they become fully grown as a nation, but don't quite know who they are yet. And that leads us to the young adult years. This is the period where they're going to be moving from the wilderness back up into the land of Canaan during the conquest to get that land back, the land that they used to live in 400 years earlier under the family of Abraham and Sarah. I sometimes call this the Justin Bieber, Miley Cyrus stage. And the reason I do that is because the Biebs and Miley sometimes are seen as being rebellious, and yet you see these flashes where they really are good and they're doing good things and they want to be good. This really captures the spiritual history of the Israelites during this phase, particularly in the Judges. So you recall the book of Judges. We called it the worst book ever, and it's the story of the Israelites in this roller coaster up and down faithfulness to God. Now, not to say all young adults are like this, but it can tend to be sort of a selfish time where you're kind of wandering around and you don't really know quite who you are yet. And this is the case of this period of the Judges. So take a look at this again, right? Growing in size, and it's also growing in identity and spiritual maturity. Asking the question, who are we in God and what is our purpose? That original purpose was to bless all the nations of the earth, but they're not quite doing it yet. Which leads us to the next phase, the settling down period. This tends to be a time when you as an adult, you want to get married, you want to have kids, you pick a career, you maybe choose a city to kind of put down roots and buy a house. So all of those can be metaphors for looking at the reign of David. This is a time when he's trying to bring the country back together, to bring unity, all of the 12 tribes to have a sense of togetherness, the north and the south that were split, to bring them together. And this is really the most stable period of their history, when David finally rises to the kingship. He establishes Jerusalem as the capital city, and he wants to build a temple, which is finally done under his son's reign, Solomon. And again, that's, as a metaphor, that's like building a house. They're settling down, and they're becoming stable. So again, look at it, right? They're finally getting into that place where they know who they are in God, and they can begin to try to fulfill that original purpose of Abraham and Sarah, blessing all the families of the earth. But they do not do that, and I call the next stage of their history the midlife crisis. Solomon, David's son, he started off wise, but the money and the power corrupted him, and he ended up marrying 700 wives and having 300 concubines, which is essentially like having a female sex slave. Now, as if this isn't bad enough, and it is bad enough, but the Bible says that Solomon married these women who practiced fertility religions. And this is religion where they use sex and they combine it with their worship in order to make the land fertile. And Solomon allowed these different religions to build temples and to be mixed with Judaism. So just when things were really beginning to settle in, Solomon sort of steers them down the wrong path. The country that David had unified splits again into two factions, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. It's almost like Solomon and Israel were now cheating on God. So that moves us to the next phase, the wisdom years. This is the age of the prophets who are going to try to come in and fix it. So if Solomon and Israel were cheating on God, sort of wrecking the family, one way you can think of the prophets is they were sort of like family therapists who were stepping in and going to do an intervention, try to bring some healthy thinking and healthy relationships back to Israel and the family. Started with Elijah and Elisha, but then moved on to Isaiah, Hosea. You had these prophets in the north. But then on down the line, these all are prophets who are sort of intervening and trying to get Israel back on track. Now, one of the peculiar things that the prophets repeatedly said was that God was allowing foreign countries surrounding Israel to occupy them as a way of punishing them or disciplining them. Maybe a positive way to say it was to get their attention. And I always say ABP, always be positive, helps us remember the three major captivities, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. And the P, positive, helps us remember that it was Persia that allowed the Jews to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the city and the temple. Now you also see here from the slide that eventually the Greeks, Alexander the Great or the Seleucids, came in the 3rd century BC and they occupied. And then the Romans in the 1st century BC did the same also. Now another message during these centuries that the prophets were trying to get them back on track was that a king, an anointed king, a Messiah, a Messiah would come. And this would almost be like a super king. Maybe you could call it the perfect David, who would return, and Israel would be back in control of their own destiny, their own country, and they would overcome their occupiers, and they would be able to get back on track to fulfill that vision quest that God gave to Abraham and Sarah to be a blessing to all the families and nations of the earth. So that's it. That's a kind of a sketch of the Hebrew Bible into the beginning of the New Testament. And so on the left, you see you've got kind of a really simple sketch of the order of the Hebrew scriptures into the New Testament. And then on the right, kind of the basic human stages of life. And my hope is that the stages of the human life will sort of be a trigger for you to help you remember the stories of what was going on in Israel at that time. Here's sort of a simplified version of it without the stages part. Right? Creation, Abraham and Sarah, the Exodus, the Judges, David the king, Solomon's fall, the exiles and captivity, ABP, and the emergence of Christianity. Is there an overall theme to the entire Bible? Christians think that there is, and it's this, that God is repairing what was broken in the Garden of Eden. And God is going to do this by blessing all the people of the earth through a culture that spent its existence wrestling with God so that they could be a blessing. So God is going to bless everybody, all the nations of the earth, in the arrival of Jesus, who is a descendant of Abraham and Sarah. But Christians take it further. Jesus made a claim that he was not just an anointed king, or even a super king, but he was actually God in human form. And so if human beings were separated from God by their sin in the Garden of Eden, then in Jesus they are reunited with God. And that is one of the driving ideas in Christianity. And Christians believe it is the eventual conclusion of the long and winding journey of the people of Israel. And so there you have it. Right, it begins with this small little family, Abraham and Sarah and his kinsmen. And then they sort of go through these stages of development. They find stability, but then they get off course. And then they promise that there's going to come a king who will finally get them back on track. And Christians believe that this is not just a king, but actually God as king, who comes and reconnects all of us to our Creator.